an economic climate where most roles are receiving many applications, it's likely that your CV will only receive 3 seconds of viewing time from a potential employer or recruitment consultant. Is your CV strong enough to get you the job? Producing the ideal CV is a very subjective issue. You'll get many different forms of advice suggesting many different styles of CV. However, there are some very simple rules you can follow to make sure that your CV is both informative and interesting. Always remember that the CV is the most important document, far more important than the covering letter, as often people will ignore the covering letter and look to see what actual experience you've got that is demonstrated through the CV. As you're watching this particular video, the likelihood is you'll be looking for a job within the marketing area, whether that be digital, traditional, brand management or marketing management. As specialists in marketing recruitment, Network Marketing have been working for well over 18 years in delivering great quality candidates to clients, and we could only do this with fantastic CVs. Before you launch in with a keyboard, have a think about doing some planning. The 5 key areas that I want you to think about: the audience that you'll be targeting, the structure of the CV, the presentation, the length of the CV, and the actual content is absolutely vital. It's not dissimilar to putting together a marketing campaign for yourself, where you're the product or the service. Let's think about the audience to start off with. As with any marketing campaign, you need to think about who you are targeting and who you're speaking to. And really there are 3 audiences, but let's focus on the 2 main ones, that being the recruiting manager or an HR manager. The recruiting manager will be specifically looking to get under the skin of your experience. They'll want to get a better perspective of your personality and how you're going to fit into the team culturally. So it's about both skills and experience and personality. If an HR manager is looking at the CV, they'll more likely be looking at it in terms of scoring against a job description, to be clear that you've actually got the experience relative to the role as it's defined. And from there, you are likely to be put forward to the interview stage with the hiring manager. The final audience is the recruitment consultant, and hopefully they'll be looking for a little bit of both that both the hiring manager and the HR manager are looking for. What I suggest though is that all of the information you present is easily understandable and easily readable. Let's look at the structure of the CV and what goes where. It should be a very simple document. We want the reader to be able to understand what experience you've got, in what organisation and for how long, so that they can establish whether they feel that you are going to fit the role that they're recruiting. I've seen a number of creative CVs, and sometimes they offer quite a significant amount of confusion, sometimes difficult to pick out experience and qualifications, and so it's unlikely that within the 3 seconds that we spoke about earlier on that you're going to get your foot in the door. Let's take a look at the CV as a document and look at the 6 different areas that we need to consider. Personal details, education, experience, company profile, position and additional information. So let's take these in the order we're going to see them on the CV. Firstly, all your personal details. We need to see on there your name, your address and your telephone numbers, preferably your mobile and your home number. We'll also be expecting an email address and potentially any addresses for Twitter, LinkedIn or blog entries. Let's make sure we double check this information, because you wouldn't believe how many mistakes we see on simple things like telephone numbers. And of course, if that isn't right, we can't get hold of you. Let's move on to the education section of the CV. I'm going to use a term here called what's recent is relevant. And so what we need to look at is first your most recent qualifications. Hopefully they will be ones that are most relevant to the role you're going to move into. I'd be expecting to see any further qualifications first, perhaps then a degree qualification if relevant, moving back then into A-levels and GCSEs. The key is not to put too much detail in this area. We wouldn't be expecting to see the detail of every single GCSE that you received a number of years ago, but perhaps just the overall number. More relevant though will be the degree you received or perhaps any postgraduate qualifications. And finally, in this section, if at all possible, try and format this information so that each qualification is just on one line. Once you've completed the personal details and education section, you should be approximately halfway down the first page. If you're at the bottom of the first page, you need to go back and edit it. We've got lots of information we want to put on this CV, and we've always got to be conscious of the fact that the CV shouldn't be too long. Let's move on to the main part of the CV, your experience. Again, there are many different ways of putting this information down on paper. However, we still believe that what is most recent is most relevant. So focus on your current role or your most recent role. It's vital that this information is accurate. If you make any mistakes regarding dates, places you've worked, company names, or even job titles, then this could open up some very awkward interview questions, which I'm sure you would rather avoid. Don't assume that every future employer will know about the company you've worked for. Always put a one-liner on the CV. This needs to explain a little bit about the company, the size of the company, and the business that it's in, perhaps discussing number of employees. This will provide a good foundation for the discussion when you get into the interview. Then we need to move on to the experience that you've gained whilst at that company. I'd suggest you produce this in summary format, rather than necessarily going into too much detail. This will enable the client or potential employer to understand completely what you've been involved with and understand how that relates to their current requirement. Please avoid going into too much detail. At this stage, you need to provide a basis from which to start the interview, not answer all the questions before the interview starts. And finally, relating to experience, if you've got very diverse marketing experience, then please try and make sure that the experience you put on the CV is specifically relevant to the vacancy you've applied for. Otherwise, you may fall into the position where you're missed off a shortlist because the client hasn't had time to read through every bit of your experience and establish whether you could be suitable. Repeat this process for previous companies and roles. However, if your experience, for example, spans 25 years, I'd recommend perhaps looking at the last 10 and very briefly summarising the previous experience. If, however, you've only been working for a couple of years, then you can certainly expand on the experience you've got in your most recent role or perhaps in the preceding role. Round off the CV with a couple of lines talking about your personal interests and your hobbies. This may be valuable to the interviewer as he may be able to identify certain traits that would help you fit into his close-knit marketing team. One area we haven't talked about on the CV is a personal statement, very often recommended by a number of people at the beginning of the CV to talk about your background, where you see your strengths and how you see yourself fitting into an organisation. If you do decide to put a personal statement onto your CV, please make sure that it is no more than 2 or 3 lines. It often won't be read by people, but if it is, it needs to be succinct and hard-hitting. If you follow the structure of the CV we've just suggested, there is no reason why your CV shouldn't just be 2 pages long. If you find it's getting longer, then look at areas within the CV that you could reduce the amount of information. Perhaps this might be in qualifications. Perhaps it might be in your experience. You may be duplicating things. As a marketeer, you will know that presentation is absolutely critical. Choose a clear typeface. Make sure that you use underline, italics and bold as necessary to create depth in the document, but don't overuse it to complicate. Remember that the CV is likely to be viewed as an email. So I would suggest that it is produced in the simplest format possible, avoiding complex configuration or formatting. I'd be quite comfortable with you leaving off salary and benefits information, and also, most of the time there is no need to put references on there. These will all be asked for either at interview stage or at offer stage. As a final check, thoroughly check your spelling and punctuation. Check dates to make sure that they are accurate, and perhaps get a colleague or friend to read through the CV, as you'll have been looking at it for a number of hours and probably won't see the obvious mistakes. And also, I would recommend emailing the CV to yourself to see how the formatting changes as it's received. We know you're going to get many different suggestions in terms of how to write a CV. However, we believe that keeping to this very simple plan will make sure that the client can actually see the experience you've got and clearly see that you are the person for the job. Good luck.